This is the Laura Coates Show on POTUS. Here's your host, Laura Coates.
Hey, welcome back to the Laura Coates Show right here on SiriusXM POTUS. Joining us now is Ashlee Stephenson, a political pollster and Republican strategist. Good morning, Ashlee. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing today, Laura?
I'm doing great. We see all of the polls that are going to continue to come in. They're going to increase in frequency, I'm sure, and of course, gravitas, because we are less than 2 months away from the presidential election and, of course, down ballot races. One of the key data points for, I think, a lot of people, including pollsters, is going to be how people will react to tomorrow's debate. It might be the one and only presidential debate between Harris and Trump. What are you looking for?
Well, it's a huge inflection point. That is for certain, Laura. And all eyes are on this debate this week and how does President Trump perform against Vice President Harris. And I think that there's a lot of known unknowns at this point in time. Really interesting coverage through the weekend about how both sides are preparing. And I'm going to really be paying attention to President Trump's hopefully ability to really draw contrast with Vice President Harris on the issues that matter and, quite frankly, what voters care about. And those are things like the economy, the border, national security, workforce and jobs and inflation. These issues that every day voters across the country are deeply concerned about, and less so on some of the personality politics, which I certainly expect we will see some of. But I believe at the end of the day, what's going to drive numbers and be a win for both sides, and it's a great opportunity for Vice President Harris too, is the ability to talk about issues and how they will make people's lives better.
I wonder about the absence of the personality. I think it's probably what the conversation around the muted microphones and what that impact is really going to be. And they can't ask each other questions, which is going to be interesting as well. But when you unpack the economy more broadly, more specifically, really, are there particular areas do you think would it behoove each of the campaigns to focus on issues regarding the national economy, or really focusing on the experience of the individual pocketbook of voters?
It's a great question, and I think that there are a couple key points for both sides that I would be paying attention to for tomorrow night. First, if I'm advising President Trump's team, I'm looking at things like the jobs report from last week. It continues to point to an economy that is cooling. We know that the feds are probably going to reduce interest rates as a result, and you want to simply remind voters that they thought things were better 4 years ago. And when you go look at the simple numbers in the CNN poll, for instance, that came out last week, in all 7 battleground states, voters still give President Trump the preference over the economy versus Vice President Harris. On the flip side of that, it's been a fascinating few weeks as the Vice President has rolled out her own economic agenda, and very much doing so, I believe, in an attempt to moderate from the Biden administration. And she really hasn't been held, from my perspective, very much accountable from the inflation to some of the other key points that's happened in the economy under this administration. And she's definitely trying to move toward the middle. I think that we can expect to see her really trying to communicate with the middle class, and that things will become more equitable, fair. Words like that was what I would anticipate to hear from her tomorrow night on the debate stage, specifically about the economy.
How would you, as a Republican strategist, advise the Trump debate response when there is a distancing between Harris and Biden's policies?
He simply has to tie the two together. It's really a simple answer, Laura, I think. You can't be the Vice President of the United States, the number 2 in command of this administration, and not be held accountable for what's happened under the last nearly 4 years of this presidency. And that's not at all a criticism, just to be extremely clear, or me putting my thumb on the scale of how I think things are going. But it's a really easy answer from a debate perspective that the President Trump simply has to make Vice President Harris accountable and tell the American public what's happened to them over the last 4 years. And the easiest thing to point to is inflation, price of groceries, the cost of gas, the things that regular Americans see every single day when they're struggling to make ends meet. And that's just been the reality of the last 4 years.
When you are, and you're seeing some evidence of that in the phrasing of the Biden-Harris administration, we're talking more about that as opposed to the Biden administration you hear from Congress. And they're, of course, looking at this debate not only from the perspective of who is going to do and perform better, but what it means for their down ballot races as well. Is the data telling you anything about how the American voters are looking to this debate, or really the presidential race, as an indication of how they might vote down ballot?
So something that's been pretty fascinating is over the last several election cycles, this concept of split ticket voters, meaning people who go into the ballot box and select one candidate from one party at the top of the ticket and somebody else down ballot, that's almost completely gone away. So what I'm really paying attention to, are there any instances in some of these big U.S. Senate races where one person might win at the presidential level and another candidate could win down ballot? Will there be any split ticket voting? And quite frankly, I think that the control of the U.S. House, especially if the Republicans were to stay in majority, has to have enough split ticket voting for that to happen. There are 17 or so Republicans who live in what are called Biden districts, meaning these are congressional districts, who voted for Joe Biden. These men and women have to really punch above their weight and likely outperform the presidential top of the ticket to be able to come back to Washington. And those are seats in places like New York, California, one in southern Arizona, a couple in the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic. These are men and women who really have to tell their story and anticipate that Kamala Harris is going to win at the top of the ticket. The last one I'll point to, really fascinating, is over in Maryland, and Governor Larry Hogan. Of course, it's expected that Vice President Harris will win at the top of the ticket, but Larry Hogan knows how to win in Maryland, and will he be able to get enough Democratic voters to cross party lines? And he's done this twice in the past. Can he replicate this again at the U.S. Senate level?
I know that you are a pollster, but I am curious as to just the range of polls that American voters are going to be seeing. I mean, everyone, I could almost find a poll for nearly everything. And I wonder how you, as a pollster, are differentiating and deciphering which are the ones, not just necessarily the exact names, which are the ones you would find the most credence in. Is it ones that display their margin of error? Are they ones that have a particularly wide group of people who are a part of the questioned voters? How are you gauging it for us to understand when we should be leaning in and leaning out?
Well, the polls are going to be coming, as you've already said, fast and furious. And this is nothing new. It drives the news of the day. It's really smart for the media outlets and anybody who's interested in getting some coverage to put numbers out into the atmosphere for people to talk about. What I do, and I think this is the safest way to analyze the polls, is I go to places like realclearpolitics.com, and I'm constantly looking at the averages, both the national presidential average, and as a reminder, we don't have a national popular vote, but the national presidential numbers do still matter. And then, of course, looking at the averages into the battleground states. I think that's the safest way to do it. But when I really like to get deep and sort of dig into the crosstabs, I always pay attention to the big major media polls. The CNN poll is a great example. New York Times and Siena that came out over the weekend, NBC, Wall Street Journal. All the major outlets, I think, do a really good job, and you can learn a lot about how the American public is thinking if you dig a little bit deeper into the crosstabs and the stories that come out of those. But always try to look at the numbers on the aggregate. Remember, at the presidential level, there are only 7 states that are going to ultimately make the difference in who gets to 270. So go look at the averages in the big 7 battlegrounds, and that will give you a pretty good pulse of where things are.
That's a really good idea. Also, coming out of the debate, what do you think are the most likely characteristics that the voters will have seen and focus on? Obviously, strategists are thinking about the nuance and the granular detail. Are voters looking at that? Are they looking at more superficial aspects of it?
I think it's going to be a little bit of both. Look, at the end of the day, my belief is that the press is going to want to cover the more sensational parts of the night, and that's to be expected and normal, and we're all looking forward to it as strategists and practitioners and those who watch politics, those sort of fun, unexpected moments, which I suspect we certainly will have a few of. I like to pay attention to the content and what is actually going to be said on the issues that matter, specifically the economy. The problem this week is, are we going to be able to figure out how to fund the government in the short term? The big problem on the horizon is the huge tax showdown that's coming next year. These are problems that we can't avoid. Government has to operate. We need a presidency and an administration and a Congress who can work together. And I'm really paying attention to who can deliver the message to give some certainty to the American public, whether you're job creators, simply in the workforce, a young person coming out of college. Americans want to know what their future is going to look like, and will we have a steady hand at the wheel who can get things done? And that's a really important message, I think, that has to be delivered. We could anticipate, Laura, we're heading into a divided Congress. Who's going to actually be able to get things done for the country? And to me, that's the most important issue to pay attention to.
So important to get your perspective. Ashlee Stephenson, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.